All right, I think we're going to get started. It's my pleasure to give a very short introduction to Kim Stachenfeld, who's a scientist at DeepMind and also an adjunct professor of neuroscience at Columbia. And Kim is doing really interesting work both at the forefront of computational neuroscience and also of AI. And I'm a little bit biased because she's my long-term collaborator. But I'm not going to give away anything. Let's welcome Kim.
Thank you so much. Yeah, I guess I graduated to long-term collaborator. I'm sort of Sam's like unofficial PhD student. So I'm very happy to be here and excited, and also appropriate out nervous to be here as well.
So I'm going to talk today about predictive models, representation learning, and simulation. I'm going to start off with a quick anecdote about, oh, actually, am I supposed to be wearing this?
Yeah.
It's really loud. This might make it loud.
No, I think it might be on.
Yeah, cool. That's a good visual.
All right, how about now? Ooh, okay, boomingly loud. Okay, cool. I'm going to start off with a quick anecdote illustrating different roles that prediction can serve. Warning, the screen's going to get really dark for a second, which is slightly shocking, so just brace yourself for that. This weekend, I did something that a lot of people, a huge traffic jam's worth of people did. I went on a wild goose chase in search of totality. My mom and my boyfriend and I got in a car and we drove up to Vermont to try and see the total eclipse. This process involved a cornucopia of predictions. There was a lot of predictive tasks that were involved. And it struck me that this is a very nice example of different roles that prediction can serve. So a very straightforward one is just that it helps us plan. Making predictions about where, like the time and position of totality was pretty essential to optimizing for seeing it. Other tasks like trying to figure out where there's going to be traffic, where there's going to be good weather. This was a model that we broadcasted forward in time and then inverted in order to make our decisions. So a lot of decisions like should we wake up at 5 in the morning or 6 in the morning involved forecasting forward how that was going to go. Another thing, though, is that the mere process of making all of these predictions forced me to learn a bunch of things I definitely would not have learned otherwise, and largely had no interest in learning. For instance, I learned a lot about the geography of Vermont. I learned what cirrus clouds are, not how to pronounce them, but how to read about them on a map. I learned about traffic patterns related to like a large influx of people for a particular event. I learned a lot of things that were really like arcane specific things, some of which might generalize to my future eclipse endeavors or the next time I go to Vermont, but a lot that are just like really specific details that this really just drove the point home that just the mere act of trying to make predictions forces you to learn about your environment. It drives a rich feature learning process. So in this talk, I'm going to talk about 2 threads of work, and I'll talk about a couple more directions that we're expanding this in at the end that are really like prediction done 2 ways, 2 different ways that prediction can be useful for asking scientific questions about the brain, and also for building AI models that are useful for simulation or prediction-based planning. I should also mention, oh, you can't see that at all. Okay, I'll just skip it. So actually, okay. In general, I might just have to read aloud like some citations and stuff that are showing on the bottom. Or you can just take my word for it that I cite all the right things at the right times. So the first project that I'll talk about is using predictive auxiliary objectives to study feature learning in the brain. We have some recent work that is coming out in iClear that was done by Qing Fang, using predictive auxiliary objectives to make a hypothesis about what role prediction can serve in the context of neural circuits outside some of the previously hypothesized roles. And then the other thing I'll talk about is using differentiable predictive models that are built of neural networks for simulation and for design. So this is a case where we're using deep neural networks to constitute a predictive model and then optimizing with respect to this model to try to find solutions to complex planning problems. Cool, okay, so I'll start off talking about Qing's project. Qing Fang is a graduate student at Columbia. I believe she is joining you guys soon as a postdoc. And she's really like fantastic and brilliant. So you're all very lucky to have her. She's gonna be in Kanaka's lab. And the perspective, the initial starting point that we're taking from this project is to start off with a reinforcement learning system. Everything okay? Oh, cool. Oh, that's good. Okay. So here we have classic reinforcement learning setup. R stands for reward. In this case, reward might be getting some tasty strawberries. State describes where you are in your environment. In this case, maybe we're 1 meter south of a hedge where there are some very tasty strawberries. And this will feed into a reinforcement learning process, in this case, Q-learning, where you're trying to predict the expected value of actions given your current state. This process is used to select an action, which is named A, and that goes back into the environment to update your state and produce new rewards. So in this case, your states, oftentimes in RL, your states are just kind of like, they're indicated with one-hots. They're indicated with indexes that uniquely identify different states in your environment. Oh, sorry, forgot about this build. So yeah, this is a definition of Q, expected future reward from taking action A from state S. If we want to have replace our state with an observation, or you could also say if we want to have a richer variable denoting our state, then we might want to start using a process that involves representation learning in order to predict Q. So here we'll be using a neural network to approximate Q, as well as an encoder neural network to encode our observation. And this whole process involves extracting features from the observation over which Q is learned. So in this case, rather than estimating the expected future reward from some discrete tabular state, we have a function that takes in some observation and produces a latent variable z, and then an RL process that takes in this latent variable z and tries to estimate future reward. And in typical deep RL structures, there isn't really this like clear division between encoder and latent variable and then downstream Q-learning process. Any layer of this process is both being optimized in order to support prediction of the expected value, and is also responsible for extracting relevant features of the observation. This fact that we are learning features of our environment means that the signal we have for which features to represent is coming from the goal of predicting our future reward. And this can be difficult, especially if reward is very sparse. This puts a lot of burden on this Q function to have information that's going to be relevant to what we'll need in the future. One thing that is a common approach is to use some auxiliary loss that shoulders some of the burden of making Z a good representation of your observation. So this basically says, instead of putting all of the burden on your feature representation, on the reward learning process, on predicting your expected future reward based on your experience so far, you also have this other loss that you're trying to optimize for, which causes you to learn features that will be useful to learning a good value function. This is really handy if you don't have very much reward. You start learning about your environment and start encoding meaningful features before they're needed. An intuition for why these are useful, for an intuition of why these are useful, I like this figure from this paper from Will Dabney and colleagues. The paper was about a specific type of auxiliary objective called the value improvement path. But this figure 1 from their paper really illustrates like this challenge of learning a good feature space that supports your reward problems. So in the case of linear RL, which is a generalization of tabular RL, but it's a case where your features are fixed and you're just trying to learn how valuable each of them are, then you don't have this problem where you have to make sure that your features stay good and represent all relevant aspects of your observation. Your features are fixed. They might be good features, they might be bad features. The benefit of learning features is that you can make them good ones, but you don't have to worry about them collapsing or overfitting. In the case of DeepRL, you can see this feature plane starts moving in order to best fit the movement of your value function. So here now you have features that are fitting to the particular information you're getting about the reward signal. And this arrow that's going off of the plane indicates the pressure that the reinforcement learning objective is putting on this representation. DeepRL with auxiliary objectives has additional arrows like this one pointing from the bottom of the plane, which forces these feature representations in different directions as well. So you can't just collapse to whatever is necessary or encouraged for supporting your current objective. You're encouraged to get other things too. Sorry. Okay. These objectives are useful for regularizing, and depending on what the objective is, they can really help with multitask learning or even single task learning in the case where your reward is very sparse, because you learn features that are capable of supporting a diverse array of policies beyond your current one. So that could be your future optimal policy, or it could just be the optimal policy for different tasks. So a lot of these auxiliary objectives turn out to be predictive, because predictive objectives are one way to encourage good feature learning for RL. My kind of intuition for why predictive auxiliary objectives are good is that the reinforcement learning problem itself is a prediction problem. It's expected future reward. And predicting what's going to happen next in general is going to contain information about what kind of reward will happen as a special case. So there's been a lot of work on auxiliary objectives in general, but particularly predictive auxiliary objectives. So the question that we were interested in is the extent to which the representational changes enacted by these objectives resemble changes that happen in neural populations during learning, and if they can explain some of the representational effects or at least recapitulate ones that we've seen. This is, okay, cool. So this is our model with, instead of just a general auxiliary head, we have a predictive network. And I'll show, and we want to draw an analogy with like multimodal computations in the brain. So we can draw an analogy between the encoder and association areas, such as sensory cortex, between striatum and motor output and the model for Q-learning system. And for our predictive module, we have different choices. There's a lot of hypotheses about predictive codes in the brain. We used entorhinal cortex and hippocampus because there's been a lot of work that both Ching and I have worked on thinking about it in the context of predictive learning. And we also just wanted to think how this different objective, the idea of driving representation learning, could help explain and make hypotheses. So for a simplified description of our auxiliary objective, I'll give that first, and then a little bit later, I'll go into more detail on the specific one we used and some interesting facts about it. If we consider our state at time t, v, and our state at time t plus 1, z prime, it's a little hard to tell, but that is a dot that's moving from one position to the position above it. A simplified version of our predictive loss is to try to predict the next latent state that you'll see. So your latent representation should be able to support this task of predicting which latent state is going to happen next. This is different from objectives where we try to predict the next observation. Here we're staying in latent space. We're trying to say, what is the next latent state of the system? This is nice because it's a little bit local and it's anchored to an internal state rather than having to rely on the next observation, but they have different pros and cons. So one thing we wanted to verify and investigate a little bit is, can we actually show that this helps in a really simplified environment where we have a sparse reward? Here we have a very small grid world. It's just 8 by 8. There's a single location that is rewarded. If we just use a deep Q network that's trained on the reinforcement learning objective, we get that line shown in blue. If we include a predictive loss, we get that line shown in orange. It's not a transformative difference. It's not that hard a learning problem, but it does help a little bit. If we look at what's happening inside of this latent layer Z, we can see how this is helping the representation. So here we're going to plot states that correspond to different observations in the environment, and we'll show them in a low-dimensional representation of Z. This might be a little bit small, but hopefully you can see that in the network that is just trained to learn Q, we end up with some structure. There's a bit of like this region is all gray and there's sort of some clustering by color, but it's a little bit mushed up, except for the region with the reward is quite expanded and quite spread out. If we look at the model that has the predictive objective, then it's much more stretched out and much more like aligned to the low dimensional structure. So that suggests that like something, that's a good sanity check, basically, that some healthy representation is forming as a result of this objective. We also looked at a couple other effects that I'll skip over for now, but you can check out the paper if you're interested in it. We looked at the effect of different prediction horizons on these objectives and how they relate to transfer. And we also did some comparison to non-predictive objectives that are online. So we're now going to look at how some of
Those experiments, like how do you set up predicting a latent state? Like, are you assuming you know the latent state or not?
Yeah, so we're using the actual latent state on the next time step. So it's known, yeah, exactly. It's like self-supervised with a latent state. So we're waiting until we get the next latent state and then using that. That is
yeah. And is are you interpreting the latent state as some kind of like hidden state where you have to do inference to find it, or is it just the actual?
Yeah, so it's just the we don't really need to do. I mean, basically, we wait till we get the next observation. We pass it through the encoder. We get a latent state. And so we're treating that as our latent state. So in a
separate network that needs the latent state or something?
No, it's just going through this encoder. And then on the next time step, we'll have another observation come through the encoder and give us a new latent state. If you kind of stretch this out, the proper like statistical model is like we wait until we get the observation over. We have like Z over here that is being used as the target for the predictive network. And it's coming from the observation on the next time step. Yeah. Does that answer your question?
Yeah.
Yeah, also, I forgot to mention, questions during the talk are extremely welcome, especially but not exclusively clarification questions. But yeah, please, I haven't presented this work externally that much, so I would really appreciate clarification questions. Yeah.
Question. For the predictive network, the A is always pre-calculated by the optimal Q value, or you actually hit all possible actions?
We use the actual observed A. The model's trained off policy from a buffer, and we vary the epsilon for that buffer. So it's like sometimes it's just a randomly selected action that's like an extreme value of epsilon being 1. And then sometimes it's generated from the Q value, and that would be the extreme value, I guess, of the epsilon being smaller. Okay, cool. So we're going to look at first some representations corresponding to hippocampus. So looking at representations in the predictive network and comparing to some hippocampal data. For the most part, what we see here is that the model recapitulates existing predictive hippocampus results. These almost fall into the like given predictive work that I've done, Sam's done, other folks have done. It would be alarming if we didn't get this kind of stuff. However, this is in the context of deep RL. There's a lot more flexibility on the feature representation, so it's good to verify. One thing is that we see place cells, we see spatially localized activity. You see this a little bit in the model that's just trained on Q learning, but not quite as much. There's a lot more, there's a lot less sparse fields. You see a little bit of smoothness, but I should have included a picture actually, but it's not quite as localized. We also see a predictive skew. So place fields tend to move back against the motion of travel. There isn't quite as much asymmetry in their profile, but we do see them moving backwards. And then we also see clustering by the reward location. This is something that you sort of see if you use a successor representation. You're not, with the classic successor representation, the kind of stuff that Sam and I published on a while ago, you're not allowed to move the states that the cells correspond to, like the state that is predicted. But you are, so it's basically like, how much am I going to visit a particular state? And that state's not allowed to move. But you can have a very, very high value for some of those states that are near reward locations, which are heavily predicted. In this case, because the feature learning allows states to move their receptive fields, you see cells move towards the reward location and a higher density of place cells clustering near a goal. And this is also what you find in hippocampus in the vicinity of a reward location. One thing that I'll skip over, but just quickly describe, is there's some results with splitter cells in hippocampus where if an animal is in a partially observable environment, so you're maybe in some central hallway and you could go right or left, and this depends on something in your past, but it's not part of your immediate observation. Cells in hippocampus tend to split. They tend to fire one way if you're going left and one way if you're firing another. The degree of this splitting shows a U-shaped curve. It ramps down as you enter this ambiguous zone, and it ramps up as you prepare to leave it. And this is something that you can also get with a variant of this model for which we use an LSTM to account for partially observable. I'm skipping over it just because explaining the LSTM takes a little while. Cool. So this is a multi-module model. It has multiple components. So one thing we can do is we can look at what types of effects this auxiliary objective has on representations in the encoder as well. So here we're looking at the equivalent of a visual cortex or sensory cortex, and we're comparing to cells or in this case artificial neurons in the encoder. So one thing that the model can capture is the effect of value learning in visual cortex. So this is an effect that depends on the RL head, the term in the loss that's trying to learn about expected reward. The task is this. Mice are in virtual reality running down a corridor. And they start off in an approach corridor, which has dots on the wall. And then at some moments in this task, they teleport to either an environment with vertical stripes or angled stripes on the wall. So it'll look sort of like that, but sometimes the stripes will be vertical like shown, and sometimes they'll be angled. If the stripes are vertical, the mouse is going to get a little bit of reward at the end of this channel. What the authors found is that this task had the effect of increasing the number of neurons, very slightly increasing the number of neurons that had a preference for vertical stripes. After the mice had learned this experience, learned this pattern, it's sort of an experience-dependent effect, you would see more cells in visual cortex with the reward-preferred pattern. This is also something that you see in the model. And this is because this objective has an effect all the way down the course of the model. It's trained end-to-end to satisfy this reinforcement learning objective. So you can see an effect even in the early visual areas that's slightly driven by these features. As in the model, it's a slight effect. It's statistically significant, but it's not like every neuron shapes itself to the striped, to the vertical stripes. But you do see some movement in that direction. Yeah.
Can it be just passive exposure?
So they have passive exposure with both, or actually, I'm not sure I understood the question. They have exposure to both, but only one is rewarded.
No preference was maybe less, the animal was less exposed to no preference.
So it's not a choice. Yeah, it's passive in that they don't have a choice over which environment they're teleported to. So are you asking if it's like an effect of having seen the reward more?
Having seen the stimuli, the third angle and the angle more than they've seen the not preferred.
No, they've seen the angled and vertical the same amount.
The not preferred is the same for is measured also on the vertical and angle.
Oh, the no preference. Yeah. So I believe the no preference is for the approach corridor. And that they're, yeah. Oh, yeah, sorry. That's that is that neurons that don't have a preference decrease in their number. So it's basically drawing from the no preference neurons in order to make neurons more selective. Yeah. Sorry, that's a fair question. So this effect in particular depends on our Q learning head. So we have two loss heads, and this one depends on Q. Now we're going to look at an effect that is more predictive in nature and depends on that head. This is also a task where the authors recorded from visual cortex. In this case, recording from IT and monkey cortex. And what the authors, Lee and DiCarlo, found is a predictive effect on the receptive fields in IT. So the training paradigm is that monkeys were trained on these sequences that progressed in a strange way. So a kind of normal sequence that one could come across in their natural environment would be to see a shape get gradually bigger. So if we go from 1, 2 to 3, that's just a dog getting slightly bigger. If we go from 1, 2 to 3 in blue, then we see an elephant getting bigger. And if you look at neurons in IT, they tend to have some overlap to start off with, where neurons that fire for 2 in either of these conditions are also likely to fire on 3 and 1. So what they did is they did a swap where they showed the monkeys sequences where instead of progressing from red to red to red, they progressed from red to blue and vice versa. And they saw that this had an effect on the receptive fields of moving the receptive fields closer to each other for that for this third location that was swapped. So blue locations would start to move towards the vicinity of red, and red locations would start to move towards the vicinity of blue. We see a similar effect in our model because these receptive fields are encouraged to move towards each other in order to support better prediction of what's going to happen next. So this is intuitively just like the features shaping themselves in order to make it easy to predict what's going to happen. And this is an effect that depends on the predictive module in order to be reproduced. So one thing I wanted to mention that's a little bit more of a minute detail, or at least more of a mathematical detail, is some interesting stuff about the structure of this loss function. So I mentioned before that the loss that I described was kind of a simplification. We have some loss that encourages the learning of predictive information. What we use for this is a contrastive predictive loss that has a negative and a positive term. And part of the reason it's worth going into this is that these have kind of interesting different interpretations that might have some implications or just interesting research threads to pull on. So the positive term is the kind of classically predictive one. That's the one that says, shape your latent representation such that one state that predicts another has a representation that moves towards the representation for the predictive one. Basically, things that predict each other, things that are next to each other in a sequence, should move closer together. This kind of has the effect of smoothing representations out temporally and moving the state representations for observations in a sequence in an order that makes that sequential prediction easier. However, if you do this alone, it can cause representations to collapse in a different way. Because one way to satisfy this objective is just map everything to 0. Then every state's representation is really close to the ones it predicts because they're just all 0. And that's not really what you want. So it's common in contrastive training to have a negative sampling loss as well. You have one loss that encourages nearby things, similar things to go near each other, and one that just causes, all else equal, your representation to expand. So for this term, we sample random states from a memory buffer and encourage the latent representations to separate them. So from in one sense, actually, I should also mention this second term is really important. If we have just the positive term, if we don't have the negative term, nothing works. If we just have the negative term, things work decently well. That just keeps high dimensionality in your representation. And I think when we were starting to think about these objectives, we thought of this second one, the negative sampling one, as sort of the boring one, and the other one as like the cool predictive one. But thinking about it more, we started to feel like this was kind of interesting too, especially in the biological context. Because even though what it's doing is pretty simple, just expanding things, actually implementing that in a biological system is pretty complicated. You need to have access to non-local states, and you need to be able to replay them, and then have some objective that's like causing representations to expand as a result of them. There's possibly other ways to do it, other ways you could encourage high dimensional representations or representational expansion without doing this, but I think it's a neat hypothesis for replay. The also kind of like tentative hypotheses we were starting to think through that we want to see if they like hold any water are that these correspond to a more pattern completion-y kind of role and a pattern separation-y kind of role, which are already hypothesized roles of different subfields in hippocampus. I'll also mention, this is contrastive predictive loss. There's other contrastive models too that are used for representation learning, for instance, for learning like object classes. And this negative sampling role is always required in contrastive losses, or pretty much always required in order to keep things from collapsing. I think there's some ways to get around it, but it's a very common goal. So other things too might require this functionality. Cool. Okay, so part one takeaways before I move on to the simulation stuff. One is that different objectives collectively describe diverse experimental data. We don't have one experiment that really requires both things to be explained. However, considering different phenomena in the literature requires all of these objectives to explain. We also just found this interesting from the perspective of hypothesizing a slightly different role for predictives in driving feature learning rather than just serving as a predictive module itself, although both of them are really useful functions of a predictive system. Another thing that's interesting about this, just from the perspective of thinking like what are the kinds of ways that we can think about where neural networks are needed to help us understand phenomena and reinforcement learning. This is a phenomena that is really particularly prominent in deep RL. It's just like, it's not something that comes up in linear or tabular RL. So gaining perspective on how the brain resolves this problem requires this more complex framework. And then we also were thinking about this as sort of a way to think about how different regions might interact with each other and get like a semi-modular, but not quite modular view of different interacting objectives. There are several limitations to this approach. The biological plausibility in general was not something that we emphasized. One aspect of this in particular is that we use non-local learning. We just train the whole thing with backprop. And of course, the whole hypothesis is really like an objective over here is affecting representations over here. How that non-local computation would manifest is something that needs to be figured out. Also, there's like a bunch of circuit differences, and we set this up in a really abstracted way. We would also really like to model some lesion data, because I think that's one of the nicest ways to test predictions of this hypothesis. Lesion hippocampus don't have a predictive objective, see changes in visual cortex. We did not find data of this kind, but I bet it exists and we just didn't look for it properly. So with the folks here and their perhaps encyclopedic knowledge of literature, I would be really eager to discuss things like that. Okay, any questions before I move on to the planning part of our predictive spread?
Just one question. How do you actually sample the non-local state connected?
We have a replay buffer that keeps track of all of the states that have been visited across different episodes, and we just sample from it. So we don't have like, yeah, basically we just pretend that we could keep track of every observation that we've seen, or at least some representative sample. It's not a huge environment, so it's pretty doable. And then we just sample them and we feed them through the encoder to produce a latent state.
So when during sampling, there's no calculation to decide whether this sample state is local or non-local.
Yeah, that's a good question. Yeah, we don't force them to be non-local. So sometimes it will be undoing itself. It might accidentally sample two states that are actually next to each other and shouldn't be forced apart. However, like in mass, it'll balance out. Yeah. I think one thing people also say, people who work with contrastive losses at larger scales, is that balancing the negative and positive sampling is something that's like often the kind of key dark knowledge behind getting something working. Like there's probably a lot that goes into that needs to be more carefully considered than we had to in this case.
Is the weighting between the positive sample and negative sample needs to be this type of parameter needs to be calculated, or it's not very sensitive?
In our case, we didn't, but in our case, it wasn't hard to tune. In general, I think it is something that's hard to tune or like requires tuning. These are, because these are small scale experiments, I think it just didn't really require such a delicate balance. But in general, that is not, yeah, that would be something that you want to tune or find with cross-validation. Okay. Oh, yeah. Yeah, not yet, but we're going to. So one thing Qing's written up is a distributional loss, which isn't exactly predictive, but it is a auxiliary objective that's used in representation learning. She's also going to look at like predicting random cumulants. So just take some random features and try to predict them. She's looked a bit at predicting next state observations, but I'm not sure we've looked at it in a systematic way. I think it was more just like kind of early on, we tried it. And my memory is that it wasn't that different from this, but I could be wrong. One thing you wouldn't need is negative sampling to do next step observation, because you don't need to worry about representational collapse because you need to have enough information in order to predict like your entire next input. Whereas, yeah, since you have this representational choice about which features to keep, you have the option of collapsing a representation if you're using the contrastive representational loss. Yeah. Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, one thing we're really curious about is just like, how do this is kind of just a predictive objective does this, and how is it different from what other predictive objectives do? I think would be very interesting to know about. Cool, okay. Yeah.
I guess this is just an auxiliary loss, so this might not be an issue in practice, but does the model ever just like learn a policy that's very good for prediction, but not necessarily?
That could definitely happen. It did not happen in these particular cases, but it definitely could happen. I think yeah, I mean, in this case, the predictive objective was pretty aligned with the reward objective. So even when we made the latent layer really small, like 2 units, having a predictive objective helped because it just like it smoothed it out. It wasn't a huge environment. It was a good feature space for this task. In general, in a richer task, you could definitely imagine a predictive loss really hurting you because you just force yourself potentially to learn a lot of information that's not relevant. If you the weight on the negative sampling term in particular would do this, because that's the term that says try to make things as different as possible. So that really is just like try to keep your space as high dimensional as you need for the number of states that you have. The predictive loss, the smoothing loss doesn't seem to like take away from the learning of the reward function as much. I had one other thing I was going to say about that. Oh yeah, actually, yeah. So one case where a predictive loss does hurt a lot, which is when your predictive structure changes. So in this is the case in experiments people have looked at with humans too. So like Ida Ahmedijad and Sam had a paper looking at how people handled changes in the predictive structure versus changes in the goal structure. And people are slower to adapt to changes in the or they have a harder time adapting to changes in the transition structure. Statistically overall, their accuracy is worse in this condition. That's consistent with a predictive model that's like that, where you have a representation that's accounting for your future transitions. It's not going to adapt when predictions change. We had a similar version of that where we scrambled the states with respect to the predictive structure. So we kept all the states, it was the same set of states, but the transition structure was really different. There, a predictive model really doesn't help you, but the negative sampling term does. So just having like more features helps, but making them be smooth over space is quite bad if that's not going to be a robust feature of your environment. Yeah.
When the test setting is like your sample. Are there you tend to get the fiction or are there
Are you asking like, is there something systematic about when the predictive objective helps and when it doesn't?
Yeah.
It's not. In some sense, it's not really what we were looking for. I guess I would say like in the cases we looked at except for this case where you're scrambling the transition structure, the predictive objectives generally help. I think like they, in our experiments, basically, unless we do like a pretty adversarial effect on the transition structure, they help. But this isn't a super comprehensive suite of tasks. It's more like a suite of tasks that's intended to like, A, provide a visualizable toy example, and then B, look like a bunch of neuroscience tasks. So I wouldn't want to generalize and be like, predictive auxiliary objectives always help when certainly that's not the case. I mean, one thing in particular, so for representation learning with language models, bidirectional, yeah, as you know, like bidirectional transformers are often used instead of just predictive ones for learning good representations, because there's information in front of and behind you that inform what your representation of each element of a sentence should be. I think similarly, like there's a lot of utility to having inverse models or explicit predecessor or backwards representations that we're not really looking at here, but like certainly they have utility and are important. Yeah.
A related question to one of the previous questions with regards to when the features are good. Like, how do you think about exploration here? Because you can't, even if your representations are good, you do need, like there are these problems and even simple ones where you need to actively figure out how to plan to find the way you have like high predictive error.
Yeah.
Like it can't be done passively. So how do you think about this?
Yeah, I mean, so we don't have we don't really I mean, I should just say we don't deal with this problem. So the price we pay is that we have to keep our epsilon implausibly high in order to like get this to work. One of the things that didn't show on my like second slide was other utilities of prediction and uncertainty representations, and for driving directed exploration is one of them. If we had some sort of uncertainty representation, for instance, like we were explicitly predicting parameters of a distribution, or we had an ensemble of models maximizing disagreement or maximizing uncertainty, would probably be the one thing I would want to set up here. I'd also be really curious what that would do to hippocampal representations. There's nice analogies with acetylcholine and how that might affect populations, which would be a really cool thing to study. Yeah, so I to be clear, like our framework doesn't really say anything interesting about it, but I that's kind of how I would probably start getting at it. Yeah, I think it's a pretty interesting question and a limitation of the present work. Cool. Okay, I will move on because I just realized I might be running a little tight on time. We're going to think about simulation for planning now. This is going to be a bit of a context shift. It's about machine learning. Our goal is to make something that is good at doing stuff, not necessarily to look like the brain. So reorient your objective function accordingly. And we're going to consider particularly the application of predictive models in physical simulation. So really different. We have pictures of fluids. They're all moving around. They're doing physicsy stuff. Not a brain in sight. Basically, we're taking the perspective here that physical simulation is a very nice application of machine learning. And we're going to try to train neural networks to predict complex physical dynamics. This has many applications. Trying to predict what's going to happen to a physical system is a thing people do a lot. It has utility in forecasting, just kind of understanding how a system works for basic science. and also for engineering and design. The framework that we're going to use here is we're going to train a neural network to do next state prediction. So we're going to take the state of the system at time t, that's that picture on the left-hand side. We're going to pass it through a neural network, and we're going to figure out how to update that state in order to get the state at time t plus 1. These are represented as images because that's how slides work, I guess. But in fact, to our neural network, these look like graphs. They consist of particles, and particles that are within some vicinity of each other are allowed to update each other. So we usually train these on simulated data. We use a physics simulator to get a bunch of trajectories, and then we train a neural network to imitate them. And it's kind of an open question, or like a good question, why you'd want to bother doing that. Why train a neural network to imitate something that we already have? And there's a couple of reasons for it. One is that you can sometimes get neural network models to be more efficient. They're often good at compensating for approximations that make things run faster, such as temporal or spatial subsampling. They're also generally differentiable. So if we have a neural network model of a simulator, we've essentially distilled the simulator into a model that we can easily take gradients. And then the other thing is that this just lets us test our ability to learn complex models from data. So even though we're training these models on simulated data, in principle, a lot of this approach could be applied to real world data too. And this could be particularly useful in the setting where we don't know the physics ahead of time, such as biology. This approach can be applied to lots of different problems. Here are some pretty videos. Oops, sorry. There we go. Here are some pretty videos from some work that came out of our team. Some of it I was involved in, some of it I wasn't. But it can be used to capture lots of different kinds of dynamics because you're just using a very general functional form. What we're going to focus on here is a case where we're going to first learn a forward model using the neural network method, and then we're going to invert it in order to solve some design problem. So this is joint work that was done with Kelsey Allen and Tatiana Lopez Guevara, colleagues at DeepMind. It was an absolute delight to work on this. Toby Pfaff, who's the senior author on this paper, also we were all kind of like working together, and it was a real, as Kelsey says, like teamwork makes the dream work situation. So they were really lovely collaborators. The architecture that we're going to focus on is something called a graph neural network. And even though I'm a little low on time, it's worth articulating some interesting things about this architecture. So basically, the way this architecture works is that you have, it operates over graph structured data. So in this case, every node in this graph would correspond to maybe a particle of fluid or a vertex on a mesh. And particles that are within some neighborhood of each other have edges between them. And these edges are used to update the dynamical features of each node. So for instance, maybe we know the velocity of every particle. Each particle looks at its neighbor's velocities and then updates them accordingly. If they're about to collide, the neural network has to figure that out and use that to inform the dynamical predictions. This architecture is local, it's equivariant, and it's relational. Local means it only looks at a particular neighborhood. Equivariant means that it's the particular labeling of nodes doesn't matter. It's pooling the neighbors around it. So the fact that you're in position 1 or position 10 of a graph doesn't matter to the result. And relational means that you're using graph structure. So we can compare this to a convolutional neural network. I think that's a useful frame of reference if you're familiar with CNNs. CNNs are also local. They're also equivariant in that you're applying the same filter to every patch of an image. Similarly, we apply the same neural network to every patch of a graph. They're not relational per se. They basically assume that there's like a constant arrangement of pixels in your immediate vicinity. But they do have some of those properties in common. Another helpful analogy, increasingly more prominent than CNNs, is transformers. Transformers are usually not set up to be local. All tokens are allowed to talk to all other tokens, but they are equivariant and they are relational. The cross-attention mechanism is a way of relating two tokens in your environment, and the particular order of tokens doesn't matter outside of their position attributes, outside of the features which tell you where they are in a sequence. If you scramble the order of tokens, but you keep their position features the same, you'll get the same answer. Transformers are more often described in the context of sequence learning, so we could kind of rearrange it to look like this. This is the same graph, but like now you've got a bunch of tokens on the x-axis, and they're predicting a next token, but it's the same mechanism of processing. I'm going to skip talking about message passing just for time's sake. But I think like one point to convey is that this property of there being local and there being relational means that we're learning local patterns that can be arranged into different global arrangements, and we're not taking the model out of distribution. So since we're learning what happens between pairs of nodes, and every parameter is really trained on a limited radius, a limited neighborhood, then we can generalize to different global configurations that have the same local structure that it's seen before. So this lets it do something really new and out of distribution. We can keep iterating this same general pattern to get larger and larger and more complex and different global arrangements, as long as you're not seeing anything locally new. This is a good fit for a lot of physics problems where you can assume locality and interactions, relational interactions are driving your dynamics. So in this case, the inset panels are training data, and the outer panels are dynamics that it generalizes to. Doesn't get it perfect, but it gets a decent job. So even though neural networks generally don't do well out of distribution, this is one dimension of being out of distribution that the model feels like is in distribution. This is really important for design problems in particular, because the optimal design might be something you've never seen before. So this is something that like is a really nice property from the perspective of a model we might want to invert. Hundreds or thousands of nodes and hundreds of time steps in the dynamical simulations, and like tens of design dimensions. Yeah. Cool. Okay, I'm gonna skip over this part a little bit. Basically, we try different optimizers with our model. The key one we're interested in is gradient-based optimizers, because arguably the whole point of this is that we have a differentiable simulator. So we want to use it to take gradients through. And we find that if we do this, the gradient-based optimizer finds better solutions that are quantitatively better and also look a little smoother in some of these different 2D fluid tasks. The top row is a gradient-based optimizer. The bottom row is a sampling-based optimizer. The time dimension in these plots is design iteration. So as time progresses, the optimizer finds better and better designs. That's why the shape is changing, and you don't see fluid. You don't see like fluid falling down and flowing. Rather, you just see the final state of each of these frames. And we have a couple different tasks. We basically see that the gradient-based one seems to be better. It supports optimizing a larger number of dimensions. One thing about the sampling-based optimizer is it doesn't require a differentiable model, so we can actually use the ground truth simulator, and we still see that these solutions are a little bit worse. And that's just because the advantage of having a good optimizer outweighs the advantage of having a really accurate forward model in these particular examples. As the design space dimensionality goes down, this stops being the case. Here we're looking at a much higher dimensional task. This is a 25 by 25 mesh, and we're optimizing the height of different points in that mesh in order to direct fluid into different purple goal regions. And this is where the gradient-based approach really shines. If you want to update a lot of parameters in a coordinated way, gradients are your friend. And one thing we wanted to look at was the extent to which having this model, this simulator that generalizes well out of distribution is actually really helping us. So for that, we compared to a model that we just trained end to end. We take a random sample of initial designs, the ones that we use to train the simulator, and we computed reward for different goals of those random designs, and use that to just train a model that goes from an initial design to a reward. This model does okay. You can see the fluid mostly goes down and mostly goes up, which corresponds to left and right for these different, for tasks that respectively want the fluid to go either down or up. But the simulator's solutions are a lot cleaner. So if we look at what's happening here in a scatter plot where we have actual reward versus the end-to-end model's predicted reward, you can see it's not doing great out of distribution. Those black dots are in distribution. Blue solutions are solutions found by the learned simulator, and orange are ones found by the end-to-end model. So it's basically overestimating the value of the solutions that it's finding, which are in fact suboptimal, and underestimating the value of the learned simulator's good ones. So it's not generalizing out of distribution in a way that supports optimization. Yeah.
Also, so once you train this model, the end-to-end model, you basically fix it and you don't do anything, right? But what if you do a little bit of like gradient updating, like how do things change? I mean, I assume that it's not going to be as good as that, but how, what's the trajectory of it?
Yeah. I mean, so it could be, yeah, I guess to start off, it's not something we looked at here. We were just interested really in like how we could do zero shot, like task agnostic prediction. My guess is it would maybe help, but cause you to overfit a little bit.
When you say like zero shot, like in the other, don't you update anything? Like, because like you have to do some updating, right? Like when you get gradients and you use it, so it's a little bit, I think it's a little bit unfair. Although again, I think that's the right, better approach to model the cognitive process, something like cognitive process. But just to be fair, I think it would be better if you had done the update the other models.
So, yeah, I mean, I guess we could have used that as like a starting point and then like fine-tuned through it. I imagine it would, yeah, I guess I'm not totally sure. I would think that because it's, yeah, I'm not totally sure what would happen. Yeah, I'm trying to think it through now. Yeah, I'm not sure. I mean, I think in this case, this is apples to apples on the kind of thing we wanted to look at, which is like, is a model that is trained end to end on predicting reward better than one that factorizes the reward prediction and the prediction process. One thing that we could learn is just the mapping. Yeah, but I guess we use the ground. Yeah, we could learn, for instance, the mapping between the last state and the reward. And that might be one way to like get the fact that like, what if the reward function itself is just hard to learn? The reward function is kind of simple, so I would suspect that's not causing this, but it would be interesting to check. Cool. Okay. I think whoops. Oh no. Sorry, give me a brief moment. There we go. Cool. Okay. I assume we end like at 3:30, right? And it is 3:30 now. So should I just skip to my conclusion slide, or is it sort of a soft ending?
And they go till 4.
Oh, till 4? Okay. Oh, great. Okay. Cool. Okay. Cool. All right. My predictive model is imperfect, but I think we'll be out of here by then.
And at 4, but
okay, cool. Great. I was wondering why people didn't look more nervous. Like, it's like I have 0 minutes and no one seems stressed. Okay, cool. So, I mentioned that our model has some structures in it that are helpful. And one in particular is that the model is relational. What we mean by that, or at least like one way that it is, there's a couple different ways. One is that it fundamentally relies on interactions to compute what's going to happen next. But another thing that we implement is to make the model translation equivariant. So an aspect of this is that instead of including the position of every node as a feature going into the model, we use the displacement vector between two nodes as a feature of the edge. So that means that the model, the learned model, doesn't actually know the absolute positions of any particles. It just knows the relative displacement between them. And this is useful for training a model that doesn't overfit to particular positions. Particular positions don't actually have any information about the physics. It's just the displacement, because that has information about the interaction. So that's one way to force the model to have this structure in it. So we're going to look at the effect of this feature. Another feature we're going to look at is one that affects stability. So in general, when we train these models, we add some noise to help stabilize them. Basically, this gives the model practice getting rid of unlikely errors that might be introduced. And this also helps it get rid of errors that are introduced just as a result of iterating over several time steps and having small errors that accumulate into larger ones. So training with a little bit of noise is basically a way to get more stable rollouts for longer periods of time. If we look at the effect of these different parameters on the success of the design process, we can see they both matter. The blue line is the full model. The red and purple lines are models that have these parts removed that are either not relative, they use absolute features, or they have no noise. And you can see the effect is kind of interpretable or makes sense under our assumptions about how these parts contribute. So the purple line doesn't have as strong a time dependence. It's just like the model is going to be much worse at every time step, presumably because it's overfit to position information, which doesn't generalize and for which there's not enough training data to wean it off that assumption. The no noise model does okay for rollouts that are short, for 50, 100, 125 length rollouts, but then starts taking a real nosedive for longer ones. And this is probably this is probably partly the effect of just the forward model being really noisy at this prediction, at this time scale, and also it has to get gradients back through that predictive model too. So it's a hard problem. The last thing that we looked at with this was a problem that was intended to kind of represent like engineering level precision. So we looked at airfoil shape optimization. This is in no way an open problem. It's like pretty known what the right answer is to this problem. So it's not like we're using the simulator to solve a new problem, but we can benchmark it and see if it's as good as the established ground truth solution to this. So what we're doing is we're comparing to defoam, which is a specialized solver, which is specialized for fluid optimization, and in particular has been used for airfoil optimization. This is the solution that defoam gives you. This heat map tells you pressure at different points in the field, and this white pattern is the silhouette, the cross section of an airfoil that's trying to like maximize lift while minimizing drag. So the kind of key features, it's got a bit of an S shape. It's fatter in the front than it is in the back. And we can look at this, the solution that we get and see that it's okay, but not the same. So it's got a little bit of an S shape. It's a little too bulgy in the front, and it's a little bit too flat, but it captures some of the key essential features. What we tried to make this work better relates actually to the question earlier, to which I responded something about ensembles. So what we did here is we used an ensemble of models. In this case, using a very simplistic ensemble approach, we took 5 identical models. We initialized them with different random initial weights, and we trained them on non-overlapping splits of data that came from the same distribution, and then we averaged them together. And this gave us a little bit of extra accuracy, which got us a solution that looks a lot more like the ground truth. You see, as we increase the ensemble number, performance generally goes up. That blue line is performance of our models. The x-axis is ensemble size, and the y-axis is reward, which is some combination of lift and drag. So we see it's approaching the ground truth as we get a higher ensemble number. And the initial is much worse. Okay, cool. So before I close, I wanted to just mention some recent work that's still in prep where we're extending this simulation approach in a new way. Because it's just based on an object I think is really interesting and I'm excited to talk about. Essentially what we're doing is we're taking the same kind of underlying neural network simulation structure, graph nets trained on dynamics prediction. But instead of doing fluid simulations, we're doing rigid body simulations. So we're reasoning about how hard objects will behave if they bump into each other and collide. And we're reasoning about complex shapes. So a classic way to represent complex shapes is to have a mesh. You basically have like a piecewise planar description of the surface of the object. But for very complex objects, this mesh will have a lot of vertices. It'll have a lot of faces to really capture curves or a high degree of articulation. So for this little old-timey car, in order to approximate this with a bunch of faces that are all joined together, you would need really like quite a few edges and vertices and faces. So an alternative is that you can use an implicit representation such as signed distance functions. So signed distance functions are a function that you can query with some position x, and it will return to you the distance between that point x and the surface of the object. So you can see an example here. Here's a cross section of the signed distance function with contours. And you can query it with some point x, and it will tell you how far you are from the surface. And then to get the surface of the object, you have the zeros of the function. This is very useful for having a more space-efficient representation of your surface in a lot of cases, because you can parameterize this function in a flexible way that may or may not be more space-efficient than your mesh. So what we're doing is that we're using neural networks to learn signed distance functions. We're parameterizing these functions with a multi-layer perceptron, and we're training them to return at every point the distance to the surface. And then we're learning a dynamics model on top of these learned signed distance functions. So here's our graph neural network, which you'll remember from last time, but now we're applying it, now we're applying it to objects parameterized with SDFs. The main reason to do that, as I mentioned, there's really a couple reasons these signed distance functions have gotten some attention. The one that was most relevant to us is that they can be more efficient representations of shape that still support collision prediction. The y-axis is the size of different object representations, and on the x-axis we have the number of mesh nodes. The size of the object scales roughly linearly with the size of with the number of nodes, not exactly linearly because you also have edges and faces to worry about. Whereas the signed distance functions that we're using are fixed because we're just using one MLP that has a fixed number of nodes. What we find for this is that we get higher errors than mesh baselines. The model's error is a little bit, but not a huge amount worse. And we get better memory and runtime in exchange for this. So our model is in green. You can see the error is higher for some of the baselines we looked at on benchmarks movie C and movie B. But our memory is a lot lower. Where this really shines is in just doing gigantic simulations of collisions that recreate like plausible physics. And these videos are honestly pretty fun. That's a bunch of shoes. Here's a bunch of torus knots. They are approximate in their recapitulation of the physics, but they're plausible. And if you try to run a mesh baseline at this size, it will just run out of memory. It's completely impossible, or at least on our computers, which are pretty big. This was a project of the And here's a bunch of diverse objects. This one gives me a little bit of, this one reminds me of my closet. Cool. So, I mean, these object representations are really useful for efficient simulation. I also, yeah, sorry.
Can you say a little bit about like the distribution you're using to simulate? Like, how are you capturing noise here?
Yes.
What do you mean? But then there's a noise model here.
So these models are trained on trajectories generated with Kubrick, which like basically takes objects from the Google scanned object collection of meshes and then initializes them with velocities and then simulates them with rigid interactions. So we train these on data that has a much smaller number of objects than this. They're also, the models are trained with noise. So the noise, yeah.
I guess I'm asking, the predictive neural network you're using, what's the like distributional form? Are you, because you have to like, write down like distribution for the next state. So, like, how do you parameterize that?
We don't set it up as a stochastic problem. So we're just predicting the mean. Yeah. Yeah.
And like my impression for some of these things is like, why these diffusion models are nice is that if you don't get the noise right, then things are like very, very brittle for simulating these.
Yeah.
What do you think about it?
Yeah. So basically, I mean, for this is the case where it probably, honestly, I think it should be more brittle than it seems to be empirically, because even though it's not stochastic, it is chaotic. So it should be that we have to like learn something probabilistic in order to avoid just like collapsing to a mode. We don't explicitly treat it as probabilistic. We just are predicting the mean displacement, and we predict over a small time scale. So each incremental step is not really like enough to accumulate the chaotic dynamics for most of the steps. Yeah, I think and then of course we train with noise to try to make the rollouts a little bit more stable. There's, for cases that are stochastic or where you want to treat them as stochastic, people, yeah, they use diffusion models for next step prediction, and then you're parameterizing distribution. They do this for like the weather prediction. We haven't had to do it for the rigids. One could apply the same general approach, like just use this structure, use this graph neural network structure to parameterize a diffusion model rather than just this next state prediction. I wish I had a better answer for you on why this works, because I've wondered that as well. But it does seem like it works okay. My guess is that part of it is that the dynamics settle after not too long a time, so there isn't that much of an opportunity to really suffer from the chaos.
And you're training from a simulator, which is
Yeah, that's true too. It's got instabilities. For instance, like if you have a square dropping, like it'll be unstable around that point. But it might just be, yeah, I think that's a possibility that the dynamics of the simulator are just like a little bit simpler than what we would deal with in the real world.
It's part of it. You're not learning the renderer.
Oh yeah, we're not learning the renderer.
Image.
Yeah, yeah. So we have some recent, that's a good point. We have some recent work that I was only a little bit involved in, so I didn't include it here. But Will Whitney and Tatiana Lopez Guevara are the first authors on it, and they learn dynamics in a somewhat similar way, but from vision directly. So the innards of the model are still a graph neural network over a particle-based representation, but they use NeRFs and point NeRF in order to go from and to multi-RGBD images. So in that case, they have to deal more with uncertainty. They also don't treat uncertainty directly. And the model works okay, but you get a lot of blurring, and like it's not, there's clearly room for improvement in that dimension. Cool, okay. So I think just to kind of close, sorry, that video is a little, will give you a headache after a while. But like, in addition to there being useful for this particular and narrow application, I think one thing I find interesting about these sign distance functions is just they seem kind of functional and multimodal. Like thinking about them from the perspective of how would you want to describe a shape so that you can both represent a complex shape and also figure out how you're going to interact with it. Having some function that tells you about your distance from it seems very compelling. They've also been popular because you can relate them to NeRFs, you can relate them to point clouds. They're a pretty like versatile representation. So for I think I'd be curious to talk to folks who think more about object representation and where these may or may not be handy. Okay, cool. Yeah, so takeaways, I mean, basically we can get efficient simulation, we can get design. General purpose is probably a stretch, but we can get it in a couple different types of design challenges with pretty complex physics. It seems some of the structure we've built into this model, like locality, equivariance, and denoising can help. Gradients are useful to the optimization process. This isn't, we set it up to be differentiable, but the fact that gradients survive and can be useful over this many time steps was not immediately obvious to us. We thought, honestly, we were going to have to do more. And our reviewers were like, there isn't enough methods development. And it's kind of because it worked without doing that. Ensembles help, and SDFs are nice. And there's a bunch of different limitations of this work. One in particular is that gradient and sampling-based methods have different pros and cons. In our work, we focused on the merits of gradients, but like hybrid methods are going to be useful. There's some really obvious places where gradients fail if the gradients are too noisy or if you move out of range and aren't getting good gradients anymore. We want to look at more diverse dynamics, especially where locality and equivariance assumptions are challenged. And we focus on particular problems where we can generalize to new global arrangements, but there's a lot of physical parameters that we would not be able to generalize well to. For instance, if we changed the material properties that we're thinking about. So getting generalization along those dimensions for more sophisticated design would be really important to that. Okay, so to conclude, here are just the things that I talked about. The kind of takeaways, the theme I anchored this to is that prediction can serve many roles. And thinking holistically about these different objectives can be a useful way, at least that's what I found, for thinking about the brain and also making machine learning work better. Deep learning predictive models is useful. I bolded that part. I hope that's true, particularly as we looked at here for efficient simulation and optimization, and for learning from real world data when ground truth models are not known. Some related work on predictions that might be relevant to folks that I didn't have time to go into relates to biological plausibility, better treatment of uncertainty, adaptive sampling, more efficient simulation with coarse graining, and the going from visual directly to simulators. If those are things that you have questions about or are interested in, check it out or ask me about it afterwards. I'd be really delighted to talk about it. And I want to thank my collaborators at DeepMind and also at Columbia and here and at UCL. I want to thank my cousin Josh for telling me things about eclipses. My lab at Columbia and additional collaborators have been very fortunate. And thank you for your attention. Any more questions?
You mentioned acetylcholine and potassium. I was just curious, yeah, if you could elaborate.
Yeah, so I took a risk. I am not an expert in acetylcholine. I know there's experimental and modeling perspectives about acetylcholine representing surprise and novelty, and that acetylcholine also seems to drive the formation of new plate cells and increased remapping. So my kind of cartoon picture to like anthropomorphize is acetylcholine is like, hey, hippocampus, this is new, start laying down some new features. We might want to learn something new and not just be like forcing this onto features that we've already seen before that don't necessarily apply to this current situation. Yeah, I think things that are required for novelty prediction or for novelty, for the recognition of novelty are prediction and uncertainty. And novelty should lead to more uncertainty too. Yeah.
I'm curious about like the auxiliary losses. I mean, you mentioned some of them. I feel like even within like the value learning loss, like there are people who think that like different like there'll be like different like reward functions are also trying to be optimized. Would you consider that as like extra auxiliary variables? Because it will be like within like the value prediction part. But yeah, like I don't know how you like.
Yeah, I mean, so I guess in this case, it was sort of like value and predictive, thinking about them doing different things. Different kinds of differently parameterized value functions would also be a very interesting thing to think about. The first one that we've thought about a little bit, but haven't done any modeling work with, is just different discount factors, different timescales that they care about. There's been some work on that in machine learning, like combining like reinforcement learning models that make predictions at different timescales. And that helps a lot with, it seems to help with reinforcement learning. I'm not sure it's been like taken up as a widespread approach, but that was like, David Silver was like really excited about that for a while. There's also, just because there's so much work on like hierarchical multi-timescale representations in the brain, I think it'd be really interesting from the perspective of trying to tease apart what different areas of the brain are doing. We've thought a little bit about discount factors as a way of thinking about changing, like a hierarchy of timescales in hippocampus along the longitudinal axis. So there's interesting stuff there. Yeah, I mean, one of the auxiliary objectives that we're comparing to now, IQN, is a distributional RL model. And you can sort of think of that as like a set of, what it's doing is, instead of predicting a point estimate for your expected reward, it's predicting a distribution of expected values. And you can think of that as predicting like the outcomes of several different RL models that all are differently parameterized in terms of their optimism or pessimism. That if you think of them as like having different learning rates on positive or negative prediction errors. So that also could be like thinking of some variety in the value space. But it's not necessarily thinking of them as like, one would be policy gradients and one would be like Q learning. Or yeah, I don't know. Are there other like kinds of RL things in the RL space that that you had in mind, or is that kind of get at it?
Yeah, like maybe like optimizing for like, I don't know, even within like the kind of the Q function, you could be optimizing for like, I don't know, like I'm thinking about the brain, like you could be like thinking about like an abstract like action of the right decision, but you could also be like trying to for like very small effectors like muscles, groups, or whatever. I feel like so that Q could also be looking into like different like, I don't know, a set of like value functions that each optimized for different.
Yeah, I see what you mean.
Yeah, like
Yeah, like the Engelhardt and like Lee style work with
Yeah.
like multiplexed dopamine
Yeah.
signals. Yeah, that would be neat. I would guess that would have a cool representational effect to think about on upstream areas too. I'm not sure. Yeah, I don't remember off the top of my head if that's something they looked at, but I wouldn't be surprised if it was. Yeah, that's a cool question.
Thank you.